The owner of the Oakland A's is blaming his customers because there are only 22,000 customers per game. What, you think the people who are not going to the A's games are reading that quote in USA Today? No. They're already busy ignoring the A's. That quote is being read by his loyal fans. And they think he's blaming them for not reproducing quickly enough. Even if you're not a loyal fan, you would think this time of year where the teams are in the standings and where every game means something, people would come out. This begins to sound like the old Bob and Ray joke about the American traveling in Italy who says to the Italian, "You don't understand English, so I'll speak louder." If you're running a business, whether it's Microsoft or the Oakland A's or the proverbial popsicle stand, and your response to low customer turnout is to wonder what's wrong with the customers, you may be in the wrong business, or the wrong guy may be running your business. But everybody in sports knows that an even more primal directive is to never blame the home fans. The commissioners know this, the guys spreading the fertilizer on the field know this, and even sportscasters know this. Hello, parenthetically, I forgot it once. And boy, did I get fricasseed for it. And I deserved it. More on that later. But back to Lou Wolf and the Oakland Athletics and their nightly attendance of 22,140. There's only one mistake he has yet to make in these quotes, which is to announce that you, rich guy, feel sorry for yourself. It's depressing. I really expected the crowds to be huge this week. I had a player come up to me and say, "I feel sorry for you, Mr. Wolf. It would just be nice if people didn't wait until the playoffs to show up." Oh, boo-hoo. The Forbes magazine calculation of the value of the A's franchise as of this March is $468 million. And its operating income, essentially its profit, $27 million. And even if these numbers are exaggerations, 8 years ago, Lou Wolf and his pals paid $180 million for the team, and they can sell out tomorrow morning for at least twice what they paid. Also, Mr. Wolf's quotes imply that he thinks attendance operates in a vacuum, that there are no other factors other than on-the-field success, that geography is irrelevant, or weather, or transportation, or the fact that he's been trying to move the team to San Jose since the ink on those two F's in his last name on the franchise buying check dried. Or sewage.
Happening now at the Oakland Coliseum, a massive cleanup from a stinking mess in the locker rooms used by the Oakland A's and their opponents.
To put it delicately, after yesterday's game, a sewer line backed up into both the Oakland A's and Seattle Mariner locker rooms. A lake of raw sewage, we hear, forcing both teams to shower and dress together in the football locker rooms.
And that was the day after the first of the Oakland O.Co. Coliseum's sewage problems inconvenienced a customer who had wanted to eat one of the stadium restaurants. The place was closed because there had been a sewage backup in the kitchen. The customer was A's owner Lou Wolf. 2 sewage problems in 2 days in his ballpark, one of them directly affecting him, and he's blaming the fans. And then, of course, last month was the third toilet-related problem at the Coliseum, with Fernando Rodney of the Tampa Bay Rays getting trapped in the John in the visiting dugout. Then this week, as the old French king said, after me, the deluge.
Oakland A's will host the Angels again this afternoon at the Coliseum, hoping nothing will stink up the joint, literally. A sewage problem has reappeared at the home of the division-leading team.
Raw sewage in the dugout. We've got video for you from last night's game. You can see the A's players standing outside the dugout to avoid stepping in the backup.
Thank goodness the A's still don't have those white cleats that they wore in the 70s. Raw sewage in the restaurant, raw sewage in the boathouse, raw sewage in the dugout, a relief pitcher stuck in the toilet. Even if you're not a loyal fan, you would think this time of year, where the teams are in the standings, where every game means something, people would come out. They are afraid of flying sewage. It's all a bunch of crap, Wolf said at the time of the first one, with no pun intended, apparently. It's a sad situation. I'm not the one in charge of raw sewage. Then again, maybe I am. Go with that. Go with, as they say, the flow. Sports owners like Mr. Wolf would be well served to remember the Yogi Berra quote that he may or may not have actually said. If people don't want to come out to the ballpark, how are you going to stop them? Well, one way is to tell the ones who did F you, and the other is flying sewage. There was one owner who had both. The Willie Mays New York Giants of the 1950s played in a 40-year-old ballpark that, according to the fan and later author Robert Kramer, quote, smelled of cigar smoke and urine. And And when the New York Giants began to dicker to move to San Francisco, owner Horace Stoneham added "F-U" to the stink. Asked if he had anything to say to a group of boys who were weeping over the impending move, Stoneham famously replied, "I feel badly for the kids, but we haven't seen too many of their fathers around here lately." Might have been the urine. Urine, Willie Mays. Urine, Willie Mays. Tough call. Owners like Horace Stoneham and now Lou Wolf may gain temporarily from symbolically F-bombing the locals, but eventually it catches up with them. It even caught up with Al Davis. Same stadium as Lou Wolf, same plumbing. Al Davis tried to move the Oakland Raiders to Los Angeles in 1980. Then he actually moved them to Los Angeles in 1982. Then he was paid $10 million to move them from L.A. to an abandoned gravel quarry in Irwindale, California in 1987. Early in 1989, he was caught negotiating to move them from L.A. to Sacramento. Late in 89, it turned out he was negotiating to move them back from L.A. to Oakland. Then in March 1990, he announced he was moving them back to Oakland. Then in September 1990, he announced he was staying in Los Angeles. Then in 1995, he actually moved them back to Oakland. That first year back in Oakland, Davis sold out every home game in Oakland. And then, despite the fervor of the Raider fan base / biker gang, they would not again sell out every home game until 2011. By 2003, Davis had been talking about moving them back to L.A. or Santa Clara or anywhere else in Oakland. And the fact that the last 10-plus seasons, the Raiders are 50 and 112, pure coincidence, no doubt. Just as it's pure coincidence that the deal the late owner got when he moved the Raiders back in, minimal rent, not having to pay any kind of fee to help maintain the, infrastructure in the stadium so, the plumbing pipes don't burst and spew sewage all over the A's. Pure coincidence. Well, pure something. Which brings us back to Mr. Les Wolf and the Barra maxim: if people don't want to come out to the ballpark, how are you going to stop them? And it's simple, common sense corollary. Do not trash the local fans. It's depressing. I really expected the crowds to be huge this week. I had a player come up to me and say, "I feel sorry for you, Mr. Wolf. It would just be nice if people didn't wait until the playoffs to show up." Do not trash the local fans. Do not trash the local fans.
They're really, really behind you around here. Like...
I know. Who am I to cast stones? And in the cases of Fellini and Elia, to cast stones on consecutive nights, no less. What do I know about trashing the home crowd? I know plenty. On April 16, 1997, I went on Comedy Central as a guest of another guy who worked here last century, Craig Kilborn. He had just left SportsCenter to go host this new satirical news program called The Daily Show. All known copies of this interview have been lost in the nooks and crannies of history. I wonder whatever happened to The Daily Show. Anyway, Kilborn used to do a quiz on it called 5 Questions, and he'd ask them of you, and you were supposed to give not just a funny answer, but the funny answer he wanted. So when he asked, "What is the most godforsaken place on the East Coast?" I thought briefly, too briefly, and I thought of how much he hated living there, more than everybody else ever felt combined. So I said, Bristol, Connecticut. Oh, ha 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 ha, tra-la-la-la-la, how droll you were there, Keith. Guess where they didn't think it was funny? Oops. Front page. Not the front sports page. The front page. ESPN anchor. It was a joke. That was the day I discovered that the Bristol Press had one of those newspaper vending boxes on every corner in town. Though ESPN SportsCenter anchor Keith Olbermann slammed Bristol during a television comedy routine last month, he said Tuesday he meant no offense. They didn't believe that either. And I got fried. And I deserved it. Because if you're in sports, you must remember, no matter how you feel, no matter what your beef might be, no matter how correct your beef is, no matter what kind of funny you're trying to make, do not trash the local fans. Take it from me, Olbermann, with 2 N's, both of which here stand for no. To you, Lou Wolf, with 2 F's, both of which stand for...
We begin with the dumbest Super Bowl loss ever. And the dumbest play calling, not merely in Super Bowl history, nor just in NFL history, but maybe the dumbest play calling since Coach Robert E. Lee sent his running back George Pickett into the stacked Northern defensive line at the Gettysburg Bowl in 1863. It's enough to make one scream. You decide to burn as much of the remaining 61 seconds of the Super Bowl by passing from the one kind of towards the goal post to the busiest part of the field just to set up a rush that never happens because you just threw away the Super Bowl. And you've taken Joe Pisarcik and Bob Gibson off the eternal hook. And this is after your idiot wide receiver gets a 15-yard unsportsmanlike for a touchdown celebration so gross it makes Marshawn Lynch's crotch grab look about as innocent as the opening credits of Sesame Street. And this is before your idiot defenders decide to pick a fight with the Patriots in the waning seconds of the season, which not only makes you losers look like undisciplined losers, even worse, it makes the Super Bowl champion New England Patriots look like the victims here. Man! And then there was the gibberish that came out of Pete Carroll's mouth defending the play call.
You know, we decided to call another call.
I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so.
We could have run it and got stuffed. We could have run it and scored. We could have scored against their goal line as well. I know that could have happened.
Because some people out there in our nation don't have that.
It just wasn't a great football thought at the time. Great football was let's make sure we match up properly so that we can have our best chance to run it in and score.
I believe that our education, like such as in South Africa and the Iraq, everywhere like such as.
In retrospect, we could have easily run it and we wouldn't be talking about this.
Our education over here in the U.S. should help the U.S. or should help South Africa and should help the Iraq and the Asian countries.
I don't know what would have happened, but this is what happened.
So we will be able to build up our future for our children.
Anybody who tells you there are 2 sides to this, like it's a news debate between somebody who tells you the moon is a natural satellite orbiting the Earth and somebody else who tells you, no, it's made out of pie. There aren't 2 sides to this. They're wrong. Not only that, this was fatal. You lose a Super Bowl due to bad planning, panic, idiocy, and a really bad pass, and there is only one solution. Blow the Seattle Seahawks up. There are no other options. History, cruel, remorseless, but inevitable history, tells us that no franchise recovers from this. Ask the Tennessee Titans. Ask Kevin Dyson. Blow them up. Fire Pete Carroll. Fire the offensive coordinator, Darrell Bevell. In fact, I would have fired him during the Lombardi Trophy presentation and made him get his own ride back to Seattle. Trade Russell Wilson. Clean it out. The franchise never lives this down. Bye, Felicia. And of course, even before all that, this was a Super Bowl full of symbolism. In the year the NFL was forced to become conscious of head trauma, Julian Edelman either played immediately after a concussion, or if Bill Belichick was right about how he would have not gone back in had the doctors not cleared him, and the Associated Press report was right, and he did pass the concussion test, he did the best impression of post-concussion symptoms ever by anybody who didn't have a concussion. And all of this was in the wake of Roger Goodell's audible hallucination Friday, which the NFL billed as his State of the League speech, in which he actually claimed to be accessible to the media on literally a daily basis, rather than, you know, the reality that he goes to his office every morning, then takes a nap until 6 when they send him home, and he is less accessible to the media on an annual basis than, you know, the groundhog Punxsutawney Phil.
I understand the obligation of my job to meet with the media. I don't know whether I meet with them in a press conference every week, but I'm available to the media almost every day of my job professionally. So we try to make ourselves available on a very regular basis. It is my responsibility, it's my job, and I will do that.
So he says that on Friday. So what happens 48 hours later at the league's biggest stage, just before the dumbest play calling since the charge of the Light Brigade into the Valley of Death in the Crimean Bowl of 1854, where he could talk to all the reporters in the universe all at the same time by going on with my friend Bob on NBC.
In the midst of all this, we requested an interview with Commissioner Roger Goodell to talk about Deflategate, domestic violence, player safety, and the many other pressing issues facing the league. The commissioner declined. And so we move on to Mike Florio, who has the latest on the Deflategate story.
Goodell wouldn't be interviewed by Costas on NBC. NBC, which is paying approximately $642 million a year just to get one Super Bowl every 3 years. And they passed on that play. They let a guy play with a head at $642 million. No interview. The Iraq everywhere, such as U.S. Americans. Interview wouldn't do. Now, as promised, a special comment on the madness of the Tea Party and the elections of next Tuesday. It is as if a group of moderately talented performers has walked on stage at a comedy club on improv night. Each hears a shout from the audience consisting of a bizarre but just barely plausible fear or hatred or neurosis or prejudice. And the entertainment of the evening is for each to take their thin, absurd premise and build upon it a campaign for governor or congressman or senator. The problem is, of course, when it turns out that there is no audience shouting out gags, just a cabal of corporations and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and political insider bloodsuckers like Karl Rove and Dick Armey and the Chicken Little chorus of Rush Limbaugh and Glenn Beck. And the instructions are not to improvise a comedy sketch, but to elect a group of unqualified, unstable individuals who will do what they are told in exchange for money and power and march this nation as far backward as they can get. Backward to Jim Crow, or backward to the breadlines of the 30s, or backward to hanging union organizers, or backward to the trusts and the robber barons. Result? The Tea Party. Vote backward. Vote Tea Party. And if you are somehow indifferent to what is planned for next Tuesday, it is nothing short of an attempted use of democracy to end this democracy, to buy America wholesale and pave over the freedoms and the care we take of one another, which have combined to keep us the envy of the world. You do not think your freedom is at stake next Tuesday? The Tea Party and Republican candidate for senator from Nevada, Sharon Angle, just decried divorce and Social Security as some of this nation's, quote, wicked ways. Mrs. Angle also compared rape to, quoting, lemon in a lemon situation in Lemonade. She would deny an abortion even to a teenage girl who had been raped by her own father. The Tea Party and Republican candidate to be the only congressman in Delaware, Glenn Urquhart, said there is no problem that abortion can't make worse. I know good friends who are the product of rape. Mr. Urquhart also says he does not believe the phrase separation of church and state was said by Thomas Jefferson. He thinks it was Hitler. The next time your liberal friends ask you about the separation of church and state, ask them why they are Nazis. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Ohio 9th, Rich Ayotte, not only ran around in a Nazi uniform celebrating their military tactics, but implies he is a veteran, and as late as this March listed his occupation as soldier, even though the volunteer militia to which he belongs has never been called, will never be called to any active service in the 29 years in which he has belonged to it. Mr. Ayotte now claims Mr. Boehner is campaigning with him over the final days. It's more than just dress up. They mean business, literally. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for New Jersey's 3rd House seat, John Runyon, defended corporate tax loopholes. Loopholes are there for a reason. They are to avoid people from really having to pay too many taxes. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for the Senate in West Virginia, John Racy, explained, quote, I made my money the old-fashioned way. I inherited it. I think that's a great thing to do. I hope more people in this country have that opportunity as soon as we abolish inheritance tax in this country. The inheritance tax applies only to estates larger than $3.5 million. For the 99.8% of Americans not affected by the estate tax, there is the minimum wage, which Mr. Racy also wants abolished. Or there is Social Security. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Indiana 9th, Todd Young, says Social Security, as so many of you know, is a Ponzi scheme. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Wisconsin 8th, Reed Ribble, disagrees. Social Security is, in fact, a Ponzi scheme. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Arizona 8th, Jesse Kelly, wants to resurrect President Bush's scam to transform Social Security into private investment accounts so the government can force you to spend part of your paycheck on Wall Street commissions and so that market manipulators can wipe out your retirement money. The Republican candidate in the Wisconsin 1st, Congressman Paul Ryan, has a more sophisticated plan. Personal investment Social Security, guaranteed dollar for dollar by the government. A fiscal fountain of youth until you find out its cost. Ryan would pay for it by taxing the health insurance you get from your employer. If you are not employed, Mrs. Angle of Nevada says unemployment benefits can neither be increased nor extended because that has caused us to have a spoilage with our ability to go out and get a job. There are jobs that do exist. That's what we're saying, is that there are jobs. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for senator in Alaska, Joe Miller, says this is academic because unemployment insurance is unconstitutional. His own wife received unemployment insurance after losing a temp job he got for her. Mr. Miller also called Medicaid unconstitutional. It proved his entire family had received Medicaid funds. Mr. Miller also claims Social Security is unconstitutional, yet hypocritically he says it should still be paid out, and then the entire issue dumped into the laps of the states. The Republican and Tea Party candidate for senator in Colorado, Ken Buck, would not stop at butchering just Social Security. Would a Veterans Administration hospital that is run by the private sector be better run than by the public sector? In my view, yes. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Pennsylvania 4th, Keith Rothfuss, has promised to overturn anything the Supreme Court decides with which he disagrees. Congress's ultimate weapon is funding. If the Supreme Court rules you have to do something, we'll just take away the funding for it. Back in Nevada, Mrs. Engel decries health care reform and also health care itself. Everything that they want to throw at us, she says, is now covered under, quote, autism. As to educating those children, Mrs. Engel will not pay for. Mr. Buck of Colorado waxes nostalgic. In the 1950s, we had the best schools in the world, and the United States government decided to get more involved in federal education. Well, since we've made education worse, we're going to get even more involved. In Ken Buck's America of 1957, fewer than 1 in 5 black children graduated high school. Fewer than half of white children did. To the Tea Party and Republican candidate in the California 11th, David Harmer. Mr. Buck is a wild-eyed liberal. Mr. Harmer once advocated eliminating public schools altogether and returning education into this country into where it was before 1876. People acting in a free market found a variety of ways to pay for a variety of schools, serving a variety of students, all without central command or control. And without girls, blacks, or even the slightest chance you could go to college. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Virginia 11th, Keith Fimian, is not so sure we need a federal bureaucracy for education. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Florida 2nd, Steve Sutherland, wants to defund the Department of Education because we can't afford it. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Texas 17th, Bill Flores, offers a trifecta plus a delusion. Get rid, he says, of the pornographic endowment of the arts, Department of Energy, Department of Education, and with them, he says, Acorn, which went out of business last April 1st. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Arizona 5th, David Schweikert, is passionately, he says, trying to eliminate the Department of Education because it's, quote, unconstitutional. And while one of the few threads uniting the ragamuffins who constitute the slate of Tea Party candidates is so-called strict interpretation of that Constitution, Mr. Miller of Alaska wants, in fact, to change the Constitution. He wants to repeal the 17th Amendment. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for Senate from Utah, Mike Lee, called that 17th Amendment a mistake. Last year, Mr. Buck of Colorado said the 17th Amendment took us down the wrong path. The 17th Amendment, of course, permits the direct election by the voters of U.S. senators. Buck and Lee and Miller not only demand you elect them to the Senate now, they then hope to deny you the right to elect somebody else next time. The ubiquitous Mrs. Engel, meanwhile, wants to repeal the 16th Amendment. It provided for a federal income tax. Mrs. Engel does not explain how, without that tax, the federal government would pay for keeping out the Mexicans she specifically attacks in her newest commercial. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, wishes to repeal the 14th Amendment because it interferes with a private business's right to ban black people from its premises, and also because it allows anyone born here in America to be American. He is worried about anchor babies. The Republican candidate for the 1st District of Texas, Louis Gohmert, fears not anchor babies, but terror babies, unborn infants, brought to this country in the womb, ready for American citizenship and pre-programmed to blow things up 15 or 20 years from now. Curiously, Mr. Gohmert has not been asked if he is in favor of aborting them. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for governor of Arizona, Jan Brewer, sees not terror fetuses, but headless bodies in endless deserts, murdered by immigrants who are nearly all drug mules. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for governor of Colorado, Dan Mays, believes a bike-sharing program is part of a plot to turn Denver into a metropolis run by the United Nations. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for Senate from Delaware, Christine O'Donnell, believes she was cleared to read secret classified documents about China because she's been working for nonprofit organizations for the past 15 years. She also believes China is plotting to take over the United States, and the first evidence of this is that, quote, China is drilling for oil off the coast of Florida. This fear of the Chinese clearly does not extend, though, to the Tea Party and Republican candidate for Senate from Illinois, Mark Kirk. One day, he held a fundraiser with American businessmen in China. The next day, he voted against closing tax incentives for outsourcing American jobs to places like China. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for Senate from Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, is also in favor of relocating employees. He testified against toughening laws on pedophiles and employers who shield them. He argued this could damage a business like the Catholic Church. In Utah, the anti-bailout Senate candidate, Mr. Lee, insists on not raising the liability limits for the next BP from $75 million to $10 billion. You have a set of settled expectations that you give to a business when it decides to make an investment in this. Our country benefits from this type of activity. Asked by the Salt Lake City Tribune if that's a kind of bailout, if it leaves taxpayers on the hook for part of the damage, Lee admitted, well, yeah, probably does. Mr. Paul of Kentucky called the nationwide pressure on BP to increase its damage payments un-American. He is also opposed to federal mine safety regulations. The bottom line is, I'm not an expert, so don't give me the power in Washington to be making rules. You are here, and you have to work in the mines. You try to make good rules to protect your people here. If you don't, I'm thinking that no one will apply for those jobs. Mr. Paul's admission that I'm not an expert does provide one of the few dovetails of this campaign. It matches nicely with Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, who refuses to offer any specifics about his plan to deal with homeless veterans. He says, quote, this election is not about details. Details have proved devilish for the Tea Party and Republican candidate for the 2nd District of Virginia, Scott Ridgell. He campaigned against the stimulus bill, including the Cash for Clunkers program. Mr. Ridgell is an automobile dealer and made hundreds of thousands of dollars from the Cash for Clunkers program. The Tea Party and Republican candidate in the Missouri 4th, Vicky Hartzler, says she and her husband are just small business owners. We just want the government to leave us alone, she said. Hartzler and her husband have a farm. In the last 14 years, that government, they want to leave them alone, has given them subsidies totaling $774,000. Mr. Racy of West Virginia told the Associated Press that America is in an industrial coma. He blamed the restrictor plate that is a bloated federal government. I can't think, he added, of very many times when a government agency has helped me. The companies Mr. Racy owns have received $2.4 million in contracts from the federal government since 2000 and $32 million in contracts from the state government since 2000. Back in Colorado, Mr. Buck apparently thought he was just speaking to a campaign worker when he self-exposed his hypocrisy. In fact, he was talking to a Democratic operative with a recorder in his pocket. Out of the blue, Tea Party nominee Buck blurted, quote, will you tell those dumbasses at the Tea Party to stop asking me about birth certificates while I'm on the camera? God, what am I supposed to do? The contempt of Mr. Buck towards his own Tea Party extends in many cases to reporters and thus by proxy to actual citizens. For instance, the Tea Party and Republican candidate for governor of Maine, Paul LePage, threatened to punch a radio reporter. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for governor of New York, Carl Palladino, threatened to take out a reporter from the most conservative newspaper in any major American city. A spokesman told the reporter that he was now off the Palladino mailing list, which has in the past consisted of emails featuring racism, pornography, and bestiality. Mr. Miller's private security guards in Alaska detained and handcuffed one reporter and threatened to handcuff two more without any legal right to do so at an event at a public school. The security company was operating with an expired license. Its chief has links to extremist organizations, and the defense was that the guards didn't know the individual was a reporter, which implies it would have been just dandy to handcuff an ordinary citizen. Ms. O'Donnell threatened to sue a Delaware radio station if it did not destroy the videotape of her interview there. When she did not like a question, she snapped her fingers at her own press aide, then shoved him. The campaign manager threatened to crush the radio station if it did not comply with them. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for the Senate from Florida, Marco Rubio, dreams more of deportation than of crushing. He said in March, quote, there are millions of people in America that hate our country, so why can't we just do a trade? We'll send you Sean Penn, Janine Garofalo, and Keith Olbermann, and you can send us people that actually love this country. This, incidentally, carries with it a tinge of irony. I don't know that any of his opponents has ever accused Mr. Rubio of not loving this country. He just doesn't love a lot of its people. And the person they all love the least is, of course, the president. The Tea Party and Republican candidate for Congress from the Florida 22nd, Alan West, had to leave our military after threatening to kill an Iraqi he was interrogating in Iraq. Now he claims to have a higher security clearance than does the president. Mr. West also told his supporters that they could defeat his Democratic opponent by making the man afraid to leave his own home. And the Tea Party and Republican candidate for the House from the Michigan 7th, the ex-Congressman Tim Walberg, wants to blackmail the president into showing his birth certificate to Rush Limbaugh. He figures he can extort this from President Obama by threatening to impeach him. You are willing to let these people run this country? This is the America you want? This is the America you are willing to permit? These are the kinds of cranks, menaces, mercenaries, and authoritarians you will turn this country over to? If you sit there next Tuesday and let this happen, whose fault will that be? Not really theirs. They are taught that freedom is to be seized and rationed. They can sleep at night having advanced themselves and they're puppeteers, and to hell with everybody else. They see the greatness of America not in its people, but its corporations. They see the success of America not in hard work, but in business swindles. They see the worthiness of America not in its quality of life, but in its quality of investing. They see the future of America not in progress, but in revolution to establish a kind of theocracy for white males, with dissent caged and individuality suppressed. They see America not for what is nor what it can be. They see delusions, specters, fantasies. They see communists under every bed and a gun in every hand. They see tax breaks for the rich and delayed retirement for everyone else. They fight the redistribution of wealth, not because they oppose redistribution, but because their sole purpose is to protect wealth and keep it where they think it belongs, in the bank accounts of the wealthy. They want to make the world safe for Bernie Madoff. But you know better. If you sit there next Tuesday, if you sit there tomorrow and the rest of this week and you let this cataclysm unfold, you have enabled this. It is one thing to be attacked by those who would destroy America from without. It is a worse thing to be attacked by those who would destroy America from within. But it is the worst thing to sit back and let it happen, to not find the time and the means to convince just one other sane voter to put aside the disappointment of the last 2 years and look to the future and vote. Because the disappointment of the last 2 years, those will be the good old days in a Tea Party America. This is the week in which the three-card Monte dealers hope to take over the government. The candidates who want their own way, who will say anything to make palatable their real identities as agents of regression, repression, and corporate sovereignty. They are here. They have energized the self-serving and the greedy and the proudly ill-informed. And if no other fact convinces you of your obligation to vote and canvass and phone and even drag to the polls the most disheartened moderate or Democrat or liberal or abandoned Republican or political neutral to vote for the most tepid of the non-insane candidates, if no other detail hands you that spark of argument with which to invigorate the apathetic, you need only commit to memory the words of Stephen Broden and Sharon Angle. She can run from reporters, but she cannot run from this quote from January and all the horror and insurrection it implies. Thomas Jefferson said it's good for a country to have a revolution every 20 years. I hope that's not where we're going, but you know, if Congress keeps going the way it is, people are really looking towards those Second Amendment remedies. Sharon Angle, too subtle for you? Second Amendment remedies? Guns instead of elections? Too implicit? Fortunately, to our rescue, to the speeding of the falling of the scales from our eyes, comes the Tea Party and Republican nominee for the 30th Congressional District of Texas, Pastor Stephen Broden. Our nation was founded on violence, he said, on tape. Was armed insurrection, revolution an option in 2010? The option is on the table. I don't think that we should ever remove anything from the table. However, it is not the first option. Thank you. The attempt to overthrow the government of the United States by violence is not the Tea Party's first option. Next Tuesday is the first option. The words are those of Nedrick Young and Harold Jacob Smith from the screenplay from the movie Inherit the Wind. As the attorney for the man on trial for teaching evolution, Spencer Tracy cuts to the gist. Fanaticism and ignorance is forever busy and needs feeding, and soon, Your Honor, with banners flying and with drums beating, we'll be marching backward through the glorious ages of that 16th century when bigots burned the man who dared bring them enlightenment and intelligence to the human mind. The angered judge replies, I hope counsel does not mean to imply that this court is bigoted. The attorney mutters, well, Your Honor has the right to hope. The judge warns, I have the right to do more than that. The attorney explodes, you have the power to do more than that. And you have the power to do more than that. Good night and good luck. As you'll hear in the next few minutes, all of us here at Countdown and a lot of us among the progressives had one major, well-defined problem with the rally to restore sanity and or fear, and we're going to address that in a moment in our number one story, a false equivalence between what we do here and what Fox News and the like do there. But first, the overall message that the tone needs to change, that the volume needs to change, was not lost on any of us. The anger in this news hour was not an original part of it, nor was it an artifice that we added to it. It was a response to a threat to this democracy posed by Mr. Bush and now by his lineal descendants. The anger happened. It will still happen. It is not for ratings, and it is not get angry first and find a reason later. But there is an institutionalization of it that may no longer be valid. That is the worst persons in the world segment, which started, of all things, as a way of defending Tucker Carlson. Its satire and whimsy have gradually gotten lost in some anger, so in the spirit of the thing, as of right now, I'm unilaterally suspending that segment with an eye towards discontinuing it. We don't know how that works long term. We might bring it back. We might bring back something similar to it. We might kill it outright, and next week we will solicit your input. It's just that today, given the serious stuff we have to start covering tomorrow, we think it's the right time to do it short term, and then we'll see what happens. And we'll also see if anybody else on TV or radio will do something similar. And now, as promised, the premiere of a new regular segment here, our number one story tonight's WTF moment. It is not that she is wrong on the issue, though she is. One thing all sides can agree on, there are many wrong on the issue of gay marriage. Also, there is one fact that has completely vanished from the Carrie Prejean experience. She was asked. She didn't just stand up there at the Miss USA pageant and cut off Perez Hilton in the middle of a question about breast implants or nuclear fission and start shouting, "I only believe in opposite marriage." She was asked. But this is no longer about her opinion. It's about her. It's about the amazing, holier-than-thou, know-it-allism that she has exuded from the moment the question was asked, right through every complaint about how she was being unfairly paraded on the public stage as the evildoers foisted news conference after news conference onto her, and the anti-gay marriage group she joined, and as the evil left-wing media forced her to do interview after interview with the likes of Dr. James Dobson.
I felt as though Satan was trying to tempt me and asking me this question, and then God was in my head and in my heart saying, "Carrie, do not compromise this. You know, you need to stand up for me. You need to share with all these people. If there were 95% of the people in the audience that were gay, you need to witness to them."
God and Satan battling it out for the future of freedom of speech inside the head of St. Carrie of La Jolla. Where exactly, Carrie, were God and Satan when the Miss California people came to you and offered to pay for you to alter your God-given body with breast implants so you stood a better chance of getting what amounts to a better job inside the Donald Trump Miss Whatever company? Where exactly, St. Carrie, were God and Satan when you posed in only your panties as a teenager and didn't know the photographer with the camera and all the lights might be, I don't know, a photographer? Where exactly, St. Carrie, were God and Satan when, incredibly enough, the same exact thing happened again and another evil photographer took hidden surveillance photos of you without your consent and without the expressed written consent of the Commissioner of Baseball?
While I don't know who released the photos from this morning, I do know who released the photos that were actually just released as of a few hours ago. And I find it appalling that a professional photographer would violate my trust by releasing an unauthorized and inappropriate image taken in between pose shots on a windy day, which I was unaware of.
Which were you unaware of? The windy day, or the photographs, or the photographer? And imagine this, somebody in the modeling business violating somebody else's trust. And St. Carrie, in the unauthorized and inappropriate image taken in between posed shots, you're looking right at the camera twice. And exactly what was up with that wind? Windy enough to get a reaction from part of your body, but not windy enough to move your hair significantly? That's some kind of wind. Satan's wind. Your grandfather fought against that wind at the Battle of the Bulge.
My grandfather served under General Patton during World War II. He never spoke about the Battle of the Bulge that he participated in as a rifleman. On April 19th, on that stage, I exercised my freedom of speech, and I was punished for doing so. This should not happen in America. It undermines the constitutional rights for which my grandfather fought for.
Thank you for bringing us back to the two cruxes here. Firstly, you were not exercising your freedom of speech during the Miss USA pageant. Your freedom of speech, my freedom of speech, has nothing to do with something as crassly commercial as a beauty pageant, nor as crassly commercial as Donald Trump. On April 19th, you were an employee of USA Inc., of Donald Trump Inc. Unless you have a written contract guaranteeing you carte blanche, and nobody does, the pageant people also have the right to take that right away from you at any moment, just as MSNBC, NBC, or GE could take away this industrial version of free speech I'm utilizing right now. Yeah, by the way, about that, don't. This, St. Carrie of La Jolla, is exactly what your freedom of speech, what my freedom of speech consists of in its entirety. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof or abridging the freedom of the speech or of the press or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. No more, no less. I'm sorry, but your grandfather did not fight to protect your right to answer a question during a network television soft porn special without consequences or fallout. And he did not fight to protect my right to criticize you on TV either. He fought to protect you from having the government stop us from speaking our minds. If you want to extend that to protecting you from having your employers stop you from speaking your mind, I advise you to join an entirely different political action committee. Because if your National Organization for Marriage suddenly decides that people with breast implants also shouldn't be allowed to get married, and for some reason you disagree with them, they won't have to honor your freedom of speech either. Now, the other part. Let's listen to the second half of that last answer again.
On April 19th, on that stage, I exercised my freedom of speech, and I was punished for doing so.
First of all, crying in a beauty pageant? There's no crying in beauty pageants. But how exactly were you punished? The Miss California people say you were entered into that contest under false pretenses. They claim you're in breach of contract, that you posed semi-nude and more semi-nude while claiming you hadn't. They say you violated the rules by joining a political organization, and they say you have not been showing up for your contractually obligated appearances as Miss California. So naturally, you got fired. Wait, she didn't get fired?
Carrie will remain Miss California. Very importantly.
So after all this, Donald Trump, who never compromised a dollar for the sake of a principle, did not suddenly kick this publicity-generating machine to the curb. And still she thinks she got punished. Oh, she assumed she didn't win the pageant because of her answer. So, that wasn't an election. It was a business decision made by a bunch of employees about another bunch of employees. They weren't electing a new pope over there. They were just expressing their corporate freedom of speech, Carrie. What the? I think the same fantasy has popped into the head of everybody in my business who has ever been told what I've been told, that this is going to be the last edition of your show. You go directly to the scene from the movie Network, complete with the pajamas and the raincoat. And you go off on an existential, otherworldly, verbal journey of unutterable profundity and vision. You damn the impediments and you insist upon the insurrections, and then you emit Peter Finch's guttural, resonant, so. And you implore, you will the viewer to go to the window, open it, stick out his head, and yell. Well, you know the rest. In the mundane world of television goodbyes, reality is laughably uncooperative. When I resigned from ESPN 13 and a half years ago, I was literally given 30 seconds to say goodbye at the very end of my last edition of SportsCenter. As God is my witness, in the commercial break just before the emotional moment, the producer got into my earpiece and he said, can you cut it down to 15 seconds so we can get in this tennis result from Stuttgart? So I'm grateful that I have a little more time to sign off here. Regardless, this is the last edition of Countdown. It is just under 8 years since I returned to MSNBC. I was supposed to fill in for the late Jerry Nachman for exactly 3 days. 49 days later, there was a 4-year contract for me to return to this nightly 8 p.m. time slot, which I had fled 4 years earlier. The show gradually established its position as anti-establishment, from the stagecraft of Mission Accomplished, to the exaggerated rescue of Jessica Lynch in Iraq, to the death of Pat Tillman, to Hurricane Katrina, to the nexus of politics and terror, to the first special comment. The program grew and grew thanks entirely to your support, with great rewards for me, and I hope for you too. There were many occasions, particularly in the last 2.5 years, where all that surrounded the show, but never the show itself, was just too much for me. But your support and loyalty, and if I may use the word insistence, ultimately required that I keep going. My gratitude to you is boundless, and if you think I've done any good here, imagine how it looked from this end as you donated $2 million to the National Association of Free Clinics, and my dying father watched from his hospital bed, transcendentally comforted that his struggles were inspiring such overwhelming good for people he and I and you would never meet, but would always know. This may be the only television program wherein the host was much more in awe of the audience than vice versa. You will always be in my heart for that, and for the donations to the Kranick family in Tennessee, and these victims of governmental heartlessness in Arizona, to say nothing of every letter and email and tweet and wave and handshake and online petition. Time ebbs here, and I want to close with one more Thurber story. It is still Friday. So let me thank my gifted staff here and just a few of the many people here who fought with me and for me. Eric Sorensen, Phil Alonji, Neil Shapiro, Michael Weissman, the late David Bloom, John Palmer, Alana Russo, Monica Novotny, my dear friends Rachel Maddow and Bob Costas, and my greatest protector and most indefatigable cheerleader, the late Tim Russert.